Today we're going to be looking at our newest shop upgrade, a fully mobile back-to-back table saw with added storage cabinets. Let's check out some of the features of this mobile base. The base has leveling casters that use a ratcheting system to lock in place. This is an important part of our build for a couple of reasons, the biggest one being our sloped floor. Creating a platform allows for the saws to sit off the floor, parallel to each other, and level to each other. Another great upgrade to this saw is the cabinet storage. We decided to build this cabinet with some super naughty spalted pecan that was locally harvested in our area. We built out a few sliding storage spaces for our extra saw blades and some deep drawers for bulky, heavier items. We also built a side drawer over here for some really large, bulky items. This could hold jigs, or if we put a hook, we could even put some bandsaw blades inside. We also wanted to improve dust collection, so we had to build a new motor box cover because this saw is probably over 20 years old and they don't make aftermarket motor covers anymore. We then finished it off with another matching cabinet. We also created a right side table extension that would match the same laminate top as the bridge. Last up is the bridge between the two saws, trimmed off with that nice pecan. This makes for a really nice work surface for very large projects.
This is what we started with. We have an old G1023 Grizzly table saw, and we have a SawStop ICS. On the right side of the SawStop, we added an old buffet cabinet that we had hanging around just to store some loose odds and ends. One of the first things we're going to tackle is putting both these saws on the same platform. Where they're at in the garage is on a changing slope. As you can see, the Grizzly has no real dust collection hooked up to it, so that's one of the things that we're going to fix in our project.
So the first thing we're going to tackle is the base. We've roughly laid out a 7-foot by 7-foot platform for these table saws to sit on. We're using 3/4 inch plywood for the platform and some spalted pecan for the side rails. Brian is jointing and then planing the side rails.
We're using the pecan to add some rigidity to the plywood. Not certain it's going to be enough, but we're going to give it a go and see what happens. We picked these caster wheels because of the weight that they can support. Each one will support around 440 pounds, I believe.
And then placing the SawStop on the platform to check for weight. He's noticing that obviously the weight is too much for the plywood, so he's going to add some steel railing to the sides in order to reinforce the whole platform. He's using a center punch and then drilling the holes into the steel.
Using the holes in the angle iron, we drilled through the platform, and those would be where the bolts would eventually go.
Once assembled, it seems a much more stable surface in order to place the saws on. We do eventually put two 2x4s on the underside of the platform. That seems to help with the weight once both saws are placed onto the platform.
Now we'll add the Grizzly. With both saws on the platform, the tops are flat and level all the way across.
Next up is removing the existing bench top and replacing it with a laminate bench top. To tackle dust collection for this particular saw, Grizzly stopped selling the motor cover, so we had to build our own. We did, however, manage to find a trap door replacement for this saw. Once both of those things were in place, we realized that the suction could be a little bit better, so we added a shield for the small opening in the front of the saw.
To do that, we ordered some brushes from Granger, and then we cut them down to size and screwed them in place.
Next, it's time to tackle the top. For the top, we're using 3/4 inch plywood and reinforcing the sides with pocket screws. Once assembled, we measured the top once again for the laminate and cut it slightly larger than we need. The side strips are applied first, and the top is applied last. We put 2 coats of contact cement on and allowed them to get tacky, and then aligned the top using 3 strips of wood in order to prevent the laminate from sticking completely. We removed the center stile, pushed down the center, and worked our way outward, and used a J-roller in order to apply enough pressure for the cement to bond. After the cement had enough time to bond, we used a flush trim router bit in order to remove the overhang. After this installation was pretty easy, we pre-drilled the holes and added nuts, bolts, and washers to secure.
Once the extension table was in place, we had to add the fence rails back in and add a temporary support where the legs used to be at.
Building the Grizzly Cabinet. After taking careful measurements, we cut the sides, top, and back on the table saw, and cut the toe kick on the bandsaw. Dados were cut on the sides of the cabinet, and all interiors were finished with a spray can shellac. All pieces were assembled, glued, and nailed together, and then sanded for a smooth finish in order to receive paint. We chose a Sherwin-Williams multi-surface latex primer that was tinted. And once that dried, we used a Sherwin-Williams all-surface enamel, color matched in a grizzly green in order to paint both the motor cover and the cabinet. After working on the cabinet, it's time to work on the drawer boxes. We used 3/4 inch plywood for the front and the sides, and 1/2 inch plywood for the bottoms of the drawers. A dado was used to create the groove for the slide-in bottom. We pre-drilled pocket holes for the fronts and backs, and once assembled, we used shellac for the drawers. We then installed drawer slides and checked for fit. The drawer faces and edge banding both needed to have the same dimensions, so we rough cut the dimensions, jointed both faces and sides, and ran them through the planer. Now it's time to work on the edge banding and drawer fronts. We then cut strips for the edge banding, checked for fit, sanded, and then secured them in place with glue and brad nails. We used CA glue to cover up the holes and flush trim the edges with a 1/4 inch flush trim bit. In order to highlight the spalting on this beautiful pecan, I tried to cut the drawer faces so there would be continuity with the grain. This took a little more time, but it was well worth the effort.
We use playing cards as spacers to make sure we got the spacing between the cabinet and the drawer faces even all the way around.
After the drawer faces were checked for size, they were ready to be installed. Faces were then sanded smooth to 220 grit, and then we applied Rubio Pure to finish the cabinet. We then installed the drawer handles and then removed all of the drawers for installation. The installation is definitely a 2-man job. Brian lifted up the tabletop so that I could slide the cabinet in. And once everything was in the right place, we were able to replace the drawers and check for fit. This cabinet is absolutely gorgeous. The next issue that we had to deal with was the bridge between both saws. Using a little bit of child labor, we were able to cut the sides and the top.
First, we'll rip some filler strips. This will allow us to build up the area between the saws. Maria is notching the filler strips. The notch accommodates the hardware for the SawStop boom arm dust collection. We have to drill holes through the filler strip and the back fence rail. Then we'll bolt the two together.
We cut the laminate and repeated the same process as before, applying 2 coats of contact cement to both the MDF and the laminate before adhering together.
Just like before, we'll take some sticks to keep the top from adhering to the bottom before we're ready, and then we'll pull them out starting from the middle and working our way out.
We used a J-roller in order to ensure that enough pressure had been placed onto the laminate in order to bond the 2 surfaces. A 1/4-inch router bit was then used to trim everything flush. We used a little bit more of that spalted pecan in order to finish the sides.
We add a little glue to glue up the decorative pecan strip.
We used band clamps to apply pressure. And once everything was cured, we used that same 1/4-inch router bit to flush everything off before cutting the ends and applying the final edge piece. We used band clamps in order to apply pressure.
We first flush trimmed with the pull saw, and then we trimmed it flush with the router.
And once everything was dried and cured, we used Rubio Pure once again in order to finish the edges off. We ended up using some 1/8 plain steel bar in order to support the bridge, from saw to saw.
We drilled holes in the bar stock so that we could bolt it to both saws. We needed to shim up the bridge on the Grizzly table saw side, so we used a little blue painter's tape and added layers until we got it just where we wanted it. The bolts that attach the back fence rail stuck out a little bit, so we marked those locations where they interfered on the bridge. We then used a Forstner to notch out a relief for the hardware. With the reliefs notched out, we could put the bridge back in place.
Next up is the assembly of the SawStop cabinet. Once we calculated the correct dimensions for the box, we started cutting each side to the right proportions and laid out the dados for the interiors. This cabinet's a little more complex than the last. For this cabinet, we would like to have a few pull-out drawers for saw blade storage and 4 drawers total for the front of the cabinet. We also wanted 1 large vertical drawer that could possibly hold storage for a few bandsaw blades. This time we used a spray shellac in order to finish out the interior of this cabinet. The exterior was then finished with the same Sherwin-Williams multi-surface latex primer that was originally tinted for the Grizzly Green, but this time I decided to change it up and use the emerald urethane trim enamel in black. This type of enamel that we chose was oil-based, and it did end up feeling a lot more durable than the surface enamel that we originally used.
We dry fit the cabinet back together so that we could add the pecan trim.
This cabinet did end up feeling a bit more like a puzzle piece because there were so many different parts and dados that we had to cut.
The reason we did this now instead of waiting till the cabinet was fully glued up was because the dados that would accept the blade storage trays had to be cut before final glue up.
Once everything was assembled, it went without a hitch. We added the edge banding and flush trim to fit. Last up were the 4 drawers that we had to make for the front of the cabinet. Using the same methods as before, we pocket screwed everything to secure everything in place, and then I used shellac spray in order to coat the interior and exterior of the drawer boxes. The drawer slides were then carefully installed, and all of the drawers were placed back into the cabinet to ensure a good fit. We tried out a couple of 3D printables for this cabinet build. We printed a few 1/8 inch spacers to help maintain the alignment of the gaps between the drawer faces. We also printed a vacuum attachment for the Craig pocket hole jig that would fit our Festool hose. This kept the work area cleaner. Pocket screws secured the large vertical drawer, and the installation was completed with drawer slides, the front face, and a matching drawer pull. This drawer pull jig made alignment a breeze. The same level of care was taken in order to create continuity between all of these other drawer faces. And then everything was sanded smooth in order to prepare for the Rubio monocoat. The last thing on our agenda was to create a pull-out system for our extra saw blades. For the sliding saw blade shelves, we used 1/2-inch plywood and glued a 3.5-inch strip of pecan to the exposed front. On the CNC, we drilled out a pocket that would not only contain the blade, but also protect the teeth and allow for easy access. We then switched out to the laser in order to create labels to identify the saw blades.
Each tray holds 2 saw blades. For saw blade types where we have a primary and a backup, we use the laser engraving to label that tray, with the primary that's being used in the front, and the backup that's already been sharpened and ready to go will stay in the back.
The plywood on the shelves was then given a coat of lacquer, and then the rest of the pecan was finished off with Rubio Monocoat Pure. After allowing the finish to cure overnight, we were ready for the installation the next morning. We removed the legs from the SawStop and rotated the platform for easier access.
This can be done with 1 person, but it's much easier to do with 2. The whole assembly wants to roll down the driveway slope a little bit.
The installation of the cabinet was pretty straightforward, and some extra hands made for quick work.
The ICS was much heavier to lift than the Grizzly was, so I had to use a Irwin quick clamp grip with the jaw face turned around and use it as a spreader to lift the extension up so that Maria could get the cabinet underneath. With the cabinet where it belongs, we were able to put the drawers and all the blade trays back in place. So the reason we ended up with 2 table saws is I've had that Grizzly forever. I bought that over 20 years ago. Whenever Maria got a little more serious about woodworking a few years ago, she decided that she wanted a SawStop as it was a little more safer and it had more safety features and dust collection on it. So in looking for one, we were able to find an ICS at a good price that was used. We bought that, and I didn't feel like I could sell the old Grizzly for enough to make it worth it. So we decided to make one as a primary, which would be the SawStop, and then the Grizzly dedicated for dado operations. So one of the reasons we put both of the saws on a platform, 1 was to make it mobile, and 2, because we had a changing slope in our garage. Where the driveway comes in to meet the garage, we've got this recess in the concrete that slopes down all the way to the garage door. What that means is that anywhere where we set that, those table saws were going to be uneven, and to use one as the outfit, it just wasn't going to work. But putting them on a platform allowed us to bridge that unevenness. While we liked the project almost in its entirety, it did create a couple complications. The casters that we put on here were just under 4 inches. The plywood that we used was 3/4 of an inch, so it raised this off the ground almost 5 inches in total. For me, that's not a problem. I'm 6 foot tall. However, for Maria, she's 5'2", and that extra 5 inches of elevation made her have to reach out over the table saw a little bit more than I think she's comfortable with. One of the coolest features I think we have on this whole project that I'm most pleased about is the saw blade storage trays. On the trays, we've got 2 slots on each tray. In the back, we've got a sharpened, ready to go saw blade. In the front, we've got the one we're currently using. So the idea is that whenever this one needs to get sent off to the sharpener, we'll have one ready to be put into service. Also, where we have 2 dedicated saw blades for each type of operation, we've been able to laser that type of saw blade onto the front. So in this case, it's a rip saw blade. So all in all, I think the project went really well. We're very happy with the results and how it turned out.